In this exercise, we're going to create the highlight on top of the pupil using yet another gradient. And this time, we won't be using a blend mode. Instead, we're going to create a gradient that starts off opaque and ends up trailing away to transparency. But before we go there, we need to go ahead and replicate this 3 gradient eye that I've created onto the left-hand side. And it's found inside this progress file called 3gradienteye.ai. I'm going to select this white eye over here on the left-hand side, and I'm just going to delete it by pressing the backspace key or the delete key on the Mac. And then I'll select the right-hand eye, the one that I want to duplicate, and I'm going to press Control semicolon or Command semicolon on the Mac in order to bring up my guides. I'll press the O key in order to get the reflect tool, and then I'll Alt-click or Option-click on that vertical guide to bring up the reflect dialog box. Go ahead and select vertical, and then click on the copy button in order to copy the eye to the other location. And that goes ahead and flips the gradients as well, which is absolutely what we want, because we want that top gradient, the linear gradient, to be flowing in exactly the opposite direction that it flowed inside the right eye, so we end up getting the proper shading effect. So far, so good. Next, I'm going to switch back to my black arrow tool, and I'm going to click on the right eye once again, because we're going to build the highlight on the right-hand side. And then I'll press Control semicolon or Command semicolon to get rid of my guides, just so I can better see what I'm doing. And I'll go ahead and press Control C or Command C on the Mac in order to copy that eye shape. Next, I'm going to click on the outline of the pupil in order to select it, because we need to create the highlight on top of the pupil. And I can't really take a shape and wedge it into the center of a bunch of attributes inside of another shape. So we're going to have to use separate shapes for this one. And I'll press Control F or Command F on the Mac in order to paste a copy of the eye with all of its gradients still intact on top of the pupil. Well, I don't want all of its gradients, and I sure as heck don't want that drop shadow. So here in the Appearance panel, I'm going to click on the flyout menu icon, and I'm going to choose Clear Appearance just to get rid of everything that's assigned to that shape. So it has no fill, no stroke. Now, we do want it to have a fill, so I'm going to switch back to the Gradient panel, and I'm going to change the fill color that's at work here just to white, like so, just by clicking on the white swatch. And then I'm going to drag white, that white color swatch, down into the Gradient panel. And I'm going to make it the first color in the gradient. And then I'm going to grab white again, and I'm going to drag it down onto the last color. So we now have a gradient that goes from white to white, which may seem like it makes no sense whatsoever. Why in the world would I do that? That's just a complex way of making a solid white color fill. Well, the reason is, if you're going to create a fading gradient that fades to transparency, then it needs to start and end with the same color unless you want the colors to change as the opacity changes, which usually is not what you want. So typically you work with the exact same color on both sides. And then in my case, I'm going to switch from linear to radial. And I'm going to take this last color stop, which is already selected, and I'm going to change its opacity to 0. Like so that we end up getting this effect here. So we have a gradient that starts out nice and bright and fades to transparency. That's exactly what we want, except I do want to adjust the placement a little bit like usual. So I'll press the G key in order to get my gradient tool. And I'm going to drag this guy up a little bit to set the highlight on the top side of the pupil, maybe even move it just slightly over to the left like so. And I'm going to change my angle value, which just helps me with the placement of this final point. I'm going to change that angle to -40 degrees. And then I'm going to drag the point inward a little bit, that is that terminus of the gradient. And finally, I'm going to take this first color right there, and I'm going to change its location to 5. And that's going to increase the size of the hot spot at the center of the eye. So I'll change that value to 5. So that means 5% of the area covered by the gradient is covered with a white circle, which creates a pretty nice effect, I think. If we go any higher, I think it starts to look clumsy, but at 5%, I think it looks nice. And then I'm going to select that midpoint skew, and I'm going to reduce its value so that we have less white going on, just a sort of a compressed area of white highlight, to 35%. And that way we get a nice bright spotlight inside of that pupil. All right, next I'm going to go over here to the left-hand eye. So instead of selecting the right eye and cloning it onto the left, which would also reverse the placement of my gradient, I want to go ahead and create a new left eye and then match its fill to the one on the right-hand side. So the direction information is the same. So I'll select this left-hand eye with the black arrow tool. I'll press Control C, Command C on the Mac to copy it. I'll click on a pupil in order to make it active. And then I'll press Control F or Command F on the Mac in order to paste the eye in front. Then I'll go back over to the Appearance panel, and I'll click on the flyout menu icon, choose Clear Appearance in order to clear away all those attributes, the drop shadow, the stroke, and the fill. And then finally, I'm going to grab my eyedropper and I'm going to click inside the right-hand eye. And that goes ahead and loads that gradient in. However, notice that the center of the gradient appears exactly in the center of the eye shapes. So Illustrator lifted the colors and the gradient information, but it didn't lift the angle value or the origin or the terminus or any of that stuff. And that's because of this weird little setting. I'm going to press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo the application of that gradient. Then I'll go down to the eyedropper tool, and I'll double-click on its icon there in the toolbox. And notice we've got two columns. Eyedropper picks up and eyedropper applies. Well, we're picking up a color with the eyedropper, and we're getting all of this stuff. Notice this, color, transparency, overprint, all associated with the focal fill, but that's the problem. It's one of our problems anyway. If we had multiple fills, we'd only be selecting one of them. We'd only be lifting one of them. And also, we're not lifting any of that other information because we need appearance turned on. So that one checkbox at the very outset needs to be on for the eyedropper to really function the way that you think it should function. Then go ahead and click OK. And now click inside of this iris in order to lift that color. And notice now we're matching the origin point, the terminus point, the angle, and all that other stuff. Now, it might not align exactly right with the new pupil, so we'll have to manipulate it by pressing the G key to get to the gradient tool. And then I'm just going to drag straight over to the right here as carefully as I can, so that I end up getting that effect right there. I think that looks good. And then I'll click on the black arrow tool to select it, and I will click off the shapes in order to deselect them. And there we have the completed eye gradients, including the highlights inside the pupils.